My Lyft driver dropped me off at SeaTac far too early for my flight. I don't know what I was thinking. I flew enough for work to know better than to arrive so early for a night flight. Still, there I was, standing in the cold December air, pulling my carry-on out of the trunk and mentally bracing myself for another tedious trip. The driver mumbled something polite before heading off, but my attention shifted almost immediately. A black Lincoln Navigator pulled up a few feet away, one of those fancy rides that replaced limousines. I couldn't help but notice the man stepping out. He was tall, with brown hair that caught the faint light just enough to make him look effortlessly handsome. But it wasn't his looks that caught me. Not entirely, anyway. You see, I have this gift, I guess you could call it. Or maybe it's a curse. I notice things, tiny details others don't. It's like my mind zooms in and slows down whenever something or someone is worth noticing. And this guy? He radiated something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an energy about him. Something that didn't quite fit the picture. He adjusted the strap of his leather bag and walked toward the terminal, his movements unnervingly smooth, like he wasn't trying to blend in, but wasn't trying to stand out either. We ended up going through security at about the same time, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every now and then I'd glance over, half expecting him to look back at me, but he didn't. Not once. By the time we both stopped at the bathrooms near the terminal, I was convinced he was just another good-looking guy who happened to be on the same schedule as me. I grabbed a latte at the coffee shop a few minutes later and nearly jumped when I heard his voice behind me. "Americano, no room," he said to the barista. His voice was calm, controlled. I glanced back, but he wasn't even looking at me. It was like I didn't exist to him. Was he following me? No, I told myself. He hadn't done a single thing that suggested he even noticed I was there. Clearly, he was just another traveler going about his night. And yet, something about him kept pulling at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just his looks or his air of confidence. It was the way my instincts, my ability, kept nagging at me. There was something off about him, something I couldn't explain. But at that point, I was done caring. My job took me all over the country, hotel to hotel, city to city. I didn't have time for mystery men or the unease they brought. I found a seat near my gate and buried myself in my phone, determined to let the whole thing go. It wasn't my problem. At least, not yet. The moment I saw him sitting at my gate, my stomach dropped. Of all the flights leaving SeaTac that night, it had to be mine. He was in the corner of the waiting area, scrolling through his phone like everyone else, blending in just enough to be invisible if you didn't know what to look for. But I did. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he was at the wrong gate, hopefully on a different flight. But then the airline agent called for first-class pre-boarding, and he got up. Just my luck. I tried not to think about him as the rest of us crowded the boarding lanes, checking our phones and listening for our groups to be called. My upgrade request wasn't anything I'd expected to go through, but I liked rolling the dice when I traveled. It never hurts to try. "Mr. Castillo?" the agent called, and I blinked, stepping forward. Yeah? "Your upgrade was just approved. You're in seat 6A, she said, handing me a new boarding pass with a smile. "Thanks," I muttered, trying not to sound too excited. First class was always a win. Free drinks, more legroom, fewer people crammed next to me. But as I walked toward the front of the plane, I felt that familiar unease creep back in. Sure enough, there he was, sitting in 6B. For half a second, I considered asking the flight attendant to move me. But what was I going to say? I don't like the vibes from the hot guy sitting next to me? No way. I'd sound insane. When I got to the row, he looked up briefly, and I swear I saw his jaw tighten. Perfect. He wasn't thrilled about this either. "Excuse me," I said, gesturing to the window seat. He nodded silently, leaning back to let me through. As I settled into my seat, the tension between us was palpable. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. For all I knew, he was annoyed that someone had invaded his personal space. But for me, it was more than that. The moment I sat down, I felt an invisible line drawn between us, something humming just beneath the surface. It wasn't physical, not really, but it was there. And the closer I was to him, the more I felt it. He adjusted his seatbelt, glancing out the window like I wasn't there. Meanwhile, I stared straight ahead, trying to ignore the faint pull in my chest, the instinct that told me he wasn't just some guy on a business trip or a vacation. By the time the plane started taxiing, I was regretting every decision that had led me to this seat. The last thing I wanted was to be trapped next to someone who made my skin crawl. Not in a bad way, but in a way I didn't understand. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the air, I made a silent promise to myself. Just get through the next 4 hours. Ignore him, keep to yourself, and land in Chicago like it's any other flight. But as I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The flight was packed, but in my mind, the cabin might as well have been empty except for me and the man in seat 6B. The hum of the engines, the clinking of drink carts, and the occasional laughter from other passengers all faded into the background. I couldn't stop watching him. I wasn't trying to be obvious, but every time I stole a glance, he seemed more wrong. Not in a creepy or threatening way, but like he didn't quite fit the picture of who he was trying to be. He flipped through a magazine he clearly wasn't reading, stared out the window at nothing, and fidgeted with his drink like someone pretending to have human habits. The worst part? The more I focused on him, the harder it was to focus on him. It felt like he was slipping through my ability to see details, as if he knew I was trying to figure him out and was somehow staying just out of reach. That had never happened to me before. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe he was just an odd guy who didn't like flying. Maybe my imagination was running wild because of how attractive he was. I mean, who wouldn't be distracted by someone like him? But the harder I tried to dismiss my instincts, the more my gut told me I was right. Something was off about him, and it wasn't something I could explain away. He barely acknowledged my existence. Not a single glance in my direction, not a single word. He just sat there, calm and collected, while I felt like I was unraveling. The city lights below started to come into view as we began our descent. The flight attendants made their announcements, asking us to buckle our seatbelts and put away our tray tables. The normal routine. I took a deep breath and leaned back in my seat, the sight of Chicago growing closer and closer as we circled over Lake Michigan. The city's glow was comforting, a reminder that we were almost there, and I'd be off this flight soon enough. And then a minute of calm descent, and it happened. A deafening explosion shook the entire plane. My stomach dropped as the left engine erupted in flames, sending debris shooting past the windows. Gasps and screams erupted from the cabin as the plane lurched violently to the right. Then, just as suddenly, it tilted hard to the left. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Except it didn't. Not really. My world narrowed to the smallest details. The terrified faces of passengers froze in panic. The flickering lights of the cabin, the shards of metal flying past the windows like slow-moving knives, the cup of water tipping from a tray table in the row ahead, the liquid suspended in midair. And then there was him. He turned to me, and for the first time, his eyes met mine. In those split seconds, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. He wasn't afraid, not in the slightest. While everyone else was consumed by panic, he looked at me like he knew, like he understood what was happening and wasn't the least bit surprised. The plane tilted further, the cabin erupting into chaos. Bags and debris flew through the air as the ground rushed toward us. People screamed, prayed, and clung to each other. And me? I couldn't move. My ability kicked in harder than ever, every detail sharpening to an almost unbearable clarity. The man next to me didn't flinch. His gaze locked onto mine until, at the very last moment, just before impact, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was cold. Bone deep, numbing cold. I blinked, my vision clearing slowly, and realized I was standing outside. The night air was freezing, sharp against my skin. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the air, catching the glow of flickering flames in the distance. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. The wreckage of the plane was scattered across a frozen field, half buried in the dirt and blanketed by smoke and fire. Twisted metal, torn seats, shattered pieces of the fuselage. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. But then I saw the people. They were everywhere, scattered across the field, shivering and confused, but alive. A woman held a crying baby while a man knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face. A flight attendant stumbled around the crowd, looking us all over, her uniform smudged with dirt but otherwise unscathed. The captain and co-pilot stood together, their faces pale but intact. We were all alive. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to take a step forward, my shoes crunching on the frozen ground. I looked down at myself, expecting blood, bruises, something to explain why I wasn't dead. There was nothing, not a scratch. And then I saw him. He was standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He wasn't shivering like the rest of us, wasn't panicked or confused. He stood tall and calm, watching the scene unfold. I couldn't look away from him. The way he moved, the way he stood, it was all wrong. Not human. A woman nearby clutched at me, her voice trembling. What happened? How are we alive? I didn't have an answer. And I wasn't even sure why she asked me. More people began to ask, began to question, their faces pale, their breaths fogging in the cold air. I scanned the crowd, my mind racing. Everyone was here. The passengers, the crew, and every single person accounted for. No one was missing. How was that possible? I glanced back at him, the man from seat 6B. He met my gaze briefly, and in that moment, I knew. It was him. Before I could say anything, the first responders began to arrive. Flashing lights cut through the darkness as police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances surrounded the field. Voices called out, directing survivors to safety, checking for injuries. I stumbled toward the growing crowd, but my eyes kept flicking back to him. He didn't move, didn't react to the chaos around him. It was like none of this fazed him at all. As the field lit up with emergency lights, I noticed something else. The wreckage. It didn't make sense. The plane was destroyed, ripped apart in ways no one should have survived. But we had. The fire grew, lighting up his face one last time before he turned and disappeared into the crowd. I wanted to follow him, to demand answers, but a paramedic grabbed my arm, guiding me toward an ambulance. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her tone urgent. "No," I whispered, still staring after him. "I'm fine." But that was a lie. I wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. As more emergency vehicles arrived, I noticed another car pulling up, unmarked, black with tinted windows. Men in dark suits stepped out, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. They weren't firefighters or paramedics. They were something else. And as one of them locked eyes with me, I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days after the crash felt like a blur. Reporters camped outside the hotels they'd put us up in, hounding us with questions we didn't have answers to. The story dominated every news cycle, and every detail of our miraculous survival was dissected to the point of exhaustion. Bird strike, they said. That was the official explanation. A bird strike had damaged the left engine, sending debris flying into the ailerons. The plane lost control, and the pilots, against all odds, managed to guide it into a soft crash landing in a field outside Des Plaines. It sounded plausible, logical, except it wasn't. Not to me. Not to anyone who was actually on that flight. We all knew we should be dead. Experts agreed the debris that hit the control surfaces made it impossible for the pilots, or even the autopilot, to maintain control. There was no explanation for why the plane didn't break apart in the air, or how we landed in a field with not a single casualty. It wasn't luck. It wasn't skill. It was him. The man from seat 6B. I couldn't get him out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, calm, composed, unafraid. He wasn't like the rest of us. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. And in the final moments before impact, he looked at me like he knew, like he was in control of what was happening. The other survivors dealt with the aftermath in their own ways. Some sold their stories to book publishers or tabloid magazines. Others went on talk shows trying to piece together what had happened. Most of them were just grateful to be alive. I wasn't just grateful. I was obsessed. I needed to know who he was, what he was. He had saved us all, I was sure of it. But why? How? And why didn't anyone else notice him? Why was I the only one? The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. I'd scoured every interview, every news clip, every photograph of the crash site. There was no mention of him outside of the ordinary. Nothing seemed exceptional about him. And then there was the government. The FAA and NTSB were everywhere, as expected. But the black-suited men? They weren't supposed to be there. They didn't introduce themselves or talk to reporters. They were just there. One of them approached me during a follow-up interview. "Isaac, isn't it?" he'd asked, his tone calm but probing. "Yes," I'd replied, my gut twisting. "We understand you were seated near the point of impact. You may have seen something unusual." I wanted to laugh at the understatement. Unusual didn't even begin to cover it. "Nothing unusual," I lied. "Just a big-ass fireball and a lot of noise." He studied me, his eyes narrowing. "If you remember anything unusual, you'll let us know, won't you?" I nodded, but I had no intention of telling them the truth, because the truth wasn't for them. Sometimes it's better if no one knew it. I wished I didn't know. I wished I could move on. And I'd made up my mind. I needed to see him. Talk to him. I needed to know. It took me 2 days to drive from Chicago to a small town in the mountains of Washington State. Shelton. I hadn't slept much, and the coffee fueling me was bitter and lukewarm, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop. The questions had been eating at me since the crash, and the longer I waited, the more the answers slipped further out of reach. I found his address on a whim, or maybe luck. The passenger list for Midwest Airlines Flight 134 had leaked online, and I combed through every name until one stuck out. Alan Carter, Shelton, Washington. I couldn't explain how I knew it was him, but I did. When I pulled up to his house, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the pine trees that framed the modest 2-story home. It was quiet, peaceful, like the kind of place someone went to escape. And he was waiting for me. Alan stood on the porch, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked resigned, like he'd been expecting this all along. I stepped out of the car, the cold mountain air biting at my skin. My heart pounded as I approached the steps, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But then he spoke. "You drove all this way," he said, his voice calm and even. "Why?" I stopped at the bottom of the steps, my breath fogging in the air. "Because I know what you did. On that plane. I know it was you." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," I said firmly. "I need to know the truth." He hesitated, then gestured for me to come inside. I climbed the steps cautiously, my pulse racing. In his living room, he looked me in the eyes, his expression serious. "You're right," he said quietly. "It was me." A rush of relief and fear flooded through me at the same time. "How?" I asked. "How is that even possible?" Alan didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, though we both knew we were alone. His jaw tightened. Finally, he said, "Because I'm not like you, like anyone on that plane." I swallowed hard, the words sinking in. "You're not human." He turned back to me, his eyes softer now, almost sad. "No, I'm not." The silence between us stretched, the weight of his confession settling over me. "Why?" I finally asked. "Why save us?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because this is my home too, Earth, your people, my people. I've lived here a long time, and I couldn't just let it happen. Not when I could stop it." It was hard to process. Impossible, really. And yet it made sense. The calm in his eyes during the crash. The way he didn't flinch, didn't panic. He wasn't like us, but he cared. I felt tears prick at my eyes, the emotions overwhelming me. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking. "You saved my life. You saved everyone's life." Alan studied me for a moment, then shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone else would have done." He was wrong. Not everyone would have done what he did. Only the best among us are able to put others before themselves. And I did owe him. Not just my life, but my trust, my gratitude, my everything. We talked for hours after that. He told me his story, how he'd come to Earth, why he'd stayed. I told him about my ability to see details, about how it had led me to him. When I finally realized how late it was, I stood to leave, but Alan stopped me. "Stay," he said simply. "I've got a guest room." I stayed, and then I stayed longer. The weeks turned into months, and Shelton turned into home. I never made it back to the hotel that night, or to my old life for that matter. I quit my job, let the world of endless travel and hotel sales slip away. I had something better. Someone better. Alan and I didn't talk much about what had happened on Midwest Air Flight 134 after that. Some things didn't need to be said, but I knew I'd found something, someone worth holding on to. And maybe he wasn't human. Maybe I'd married an alien who could shield a plane full of people from certain death. But I still never flew again.